Got our photo archives here, which don't get used as many in the digital age, but you know, this is kind of the history of the Dead here in photo form. There's been debates if they're a San Francisco band or a Marin band or a Palo Alto band or a Santa Clara band, but you know they've always also been a New York band because when they've come here, they would do these amazing long runs of shows, dating back to 1967 when they came in June for an extended run at the Cafe Au Go-Go and played their first show here in New York at Thompson Square Park. They also played Central Park during that run. And it was, there's always been, I would say, a very similar creative energy between San Francisco and New York. Though they might explore different styles at different times, there's a sense of, adventure and a sense that anything could happen in both those cities. They're both artistic cities. They're both very culturally active cities. And, the Dead would come here and roost for weeks at a time. And that obviously continued to their later days when they would do multi-night runs at Madison Square Garden and in the summer out at Giant Stadium. So there's always been a really, really strong Grateful Dead scene, and one that's also been tied to kind of like the New York underground in that sense, whether it's the biker culture or the punk scene later on. There's been a lot of great parallels in that world. I always like to say it's funny that one of the fans in the audience at one of those early Cafe Au Go-Go shows in 1967 was Lenny Kaye, who just a few years later would obviously go on to form Patti Smith Group with Patti and really help invent what is now known as the punk scene.
We're here by the Fillmore East where the Dead played, probably a couple dozen times between 1968 and when the venue closed in 1971. And this was really the epicenter of where the Dead played in New York. Their first ever show in the city was right down the block in that direction at Tompkins Square Park at the Bandshell in June 1967. And they played all over this neighborhood, really for, from that moment until the mid-70s, and then they started playing New York sparingly. But they hit New York over and over and over again during those early years as a real strategy. They wanted to cultivate a fan base on the East Coast, and New York was the place to do that. So they played at the Electric Circus, which was like a block that way and around the corner. They played at the Anderson Theater, which was that way. It was like the Dead's kind of center of activity in New York for a few years. I mean, all those shows when they were saturating the New York area, it was really kind of the beginning of people following them around obsessively and going to every show just, because they were different every night and they could. That was kind of how Grateful Dead tour grew, is that it was kind of these concentric circles where, you go a little bit further each time. Maybe if you lived in New York, you'd go to Jersey City, or maybe, they're playing in Connecticut, so you go up to like Middlebury or New Haven or something like that. And eventually, you start going down the coast or going west, and that's kind of what happened all over the country in the early 70s.
In some ways, I feel like New York City was the capital of Deadheaddom. But the shows in New York were always super intense because New York Deadheads had an edge, like New Yorkers of all types, that I really feel like was passed on to the band when they were playing. So the shows on the West Coast, like at the Greek Theater and the Frost and the Kaiser and all the local Bay Area shows that I loved seeing, felt like sort of family shows. They were like for lifers who loved the Dead so much that they would actually relocate so they could see them as much as possible. But Dead shows, particularly at Madison Square Garden, were especially intense because I feel like New Yorkers live in an environment that is almost brutal from day to day, but there's as much heaven in New York as there is hell. And so I feel like being in New York brought out the heaven and hell in the band's music.
We're standing here in front of Madison Square Garden where the Grateful Dead played a number of shows. Jerry, in particular, loved New York. I found this great line about New York that didn't make sense to put in the film because it's maybe a little bit too New York specific. But it has to do with Jerry was a rabid anti-authoritarian. He didn't want to be made into an authority figure, and he didn't like authority figures. And he often, if you'd get him riled up, he'd start talking about the little cop inside all of us that, we should silence once and for all. At one point, he's talking to Dennis McNally, who was their biographer and their publicist, who's actually from New York. He says, for me, psychedelics gave me a sense of the value of the individual human that, I can't shake it. I'm sort of stuck with it now. And New York it doesn't exist because it's governable, it runs because these people are willing to believe, each one of them, that they're gonna hold it together for one more day. It's a working chaos, you know what I mean? It's a functioning chaos. It's not controlled. You can't control a place like New York. I love that, and like when I read that, I thought, man, that is exactly what I love about New York. When you're a New Yorker, you have a functional understanding of how to get along with other people. And that's one of the things I learned from the Grateful Dead also.
In the early years, they were really fighting very hard against playing big venues. I know they had a lot of issues with Nassau Coliseum. They played there in '73 twice, and security was super harsh at those shows. Like when you listen to the audience tapes, you can really hear the vibes getting bad. I think the Dead were very hesitant to play Madison Square Garden. I think they liked playing smaller venues. I know, they took a year off in 1975 and into 1976, kind of with the intention of scaling it back. And when they came back after that point, they played a tour of just small theaters, including the Beacon, which was the only time they ever played the Beacon. And the popularity just got out of hand really quickly after that. So they started playing the Garden, but very quickly after they start playing the Garden, they go back and they play Radio City Music Hall for that week of shows of acoustic and electric sets.
Here outside Radio City here on 50th Street, the Radio City shows in October 1980 were special because they did something they hadn't done in about 10 years, which was they did an acoustic set to open each night, and then a regular electric first set and a regular electric second set. And so the acoustic set, what they did was, as it sounds, they played acoustic instruments with the exception of Phil, who played an electric bass. But the band gathered, front-ish of the stage. The drummers were in front of their drum sets behind the band. Bill had a small trap set, Mickey playing congas, Jerry and Bob, with glorious acoustic guitars. And what they did during those sets was they varied their acoustic set each night, but they really hit a lot of these, long unplayed classics each night. Famously, they closed every acoustic set with Ripple. I think if you were to ask any Deadhead about one of the most special aspects of the acoustic October 1980 sets, it would be the reappearance of Ripple.
When the Dead were playing in Madison Square Garden, you always felt like if there was one place on the whole of planet Earth where you could be at that moment, you would be there at the Garden. For me, it was being at the Garden in the Phil Zone, where you could really feel the bass waves coming from the speakers. But there was an anthropologist would call it like an event quality to Dead shows at Madison Square Garden, because the expectations of the crowd were really intense. The audience was really knowledgeable about the music. So when the Dead would do these little nuances in their jams that alluded to other performances or whatever, everybody would get it. And you would feel like you were in a room full of people who had attained the state that Phil Lesh calls being a group mind, where you're really synchronized together and the band is synchronized with you.
The Grateful Dead would draw huge cheers from the crowd whenever they played a song that mentioned New York City, like Ramble on Rose, just like New York City, woo! Or in Truckin', New York got the ways and means.
But I've kind of noticed listening to tapes from the 70s that sometimes the New York lines would get cheers in places you wouldn't expect, like in Pennsylvania or something like that, or like even kind of down in the South, when they would do, just like New York City and Ramble on Rose, they would just be like.
Even better than the references in like Ramble on Rose to New York City or whatever was something that the Dead did on January 10th, 1979 at Nassau Coliseum. That was my first Dark Star. As every Deadhead knows, Dark Star has a kind of mythic status. My friend Tom Reed from Oberlin and I went to Nassau Coliseum on January 10th. Unexpectedly, they busted out Dark Star for the first time in years. But here's what makes it interesting. They played Dark Star into this very exploratory jam, as they always did, and then into what was called Drums in Space. But the space was the sounds of traffic in probably Times Square. I mean, I may be being too specific. It was sort of the sound of New York City. It sounded like taxi horns honking and cars honking and sort of grinding machinery or whatever. That was one of the moments when I saw that the Dead's mode of complete openness to the inspirations of the moment could allow them to channel even the environment of New York City into their music.
I think that the modern Grateful Dead scene in New York could really be traced back to Wetlands, which was owned by Peter Shapiro, Relix's publisher and the proprietor of Brooklyn Bowl, and his predecessor at Wetlands, Larry Block, who was a huge Deadhead and really wanted to kind of find a place where Deadheads could commune in New York City. And Wetlands was an activism center that tied back to that 1960s mentality that we could change the world through music. They had a VW bus when you walked in there, and that really was the incubator for the modern jam band scene in general, and especially the modern New York Grateful Dead world. Not only did they obviously have shows tied to the Grateful Dead's long runs in New York, whether that's after shows or shows the days leading up to that, but they had Grateful Dead Tuesdays. It's called the Dead Center All Stars would play there. And a lot of the people now that have gone on to be the architects of the modern jam band scene got their start there. Joe Russo would play there regularly with his band Fat Mama, who were more of like a Herbie Hancock-inspired jazz fusion band. Some of the members of the Dead themselves, like Mickey Hart came through Wetlands and played. Bands like Blues Traveler and Spin Doctors and Fish and Dave Matthews, who kind of took some of the Dead's mantle, would host legendary shows at Wetlands. And I think that because there was this Grateful Dead focused club and this safe haven for Grateful Dead fans down in Tribeca, it allowed a new generation of Grateful Dead fans and jam band fans to kind of claim New York as their own.